June 18th, 1944, Camp Hearn, Texas. The smell reached us before anything else. It drifted through the camp slowly, almost politely, as if it were unsure it belonged there. Warm, salty, faintly sweet. It slid past the wooden barracks, slipped through the narrow gaps in the barbed wire, and settled over the gravel yard where we stood in line. I remember thinking, very clearly, that it was the wrong smell for this place. Prisons, as I understood them, were supposed to smell like sweat, disinfectant, wet wood, and fear. They were supposed to smell thin, empty. This smell was none of those things. It was heavy. It had weight. It reminded the body that it had once known comfort. The Texas sun pressed down on us without apology. It was not like the filtered gray light of Europe. It did not soften edges or forgive weakness. It flattened everything, burned the color out of faces, turned shadows sharp and unforgiving. Heat shimmered above the gravel. The barbed wire fence beside us trembled faintly, metal expanding under the strain of noon. Gravel crunched beneath boots. An American guard passed by with his rifle slung loosely over one shoulder, not gripping it, not watching us closely. That alone still felt wrong to me. Guards were supposed to stare. They were supposed to remind you, constantly, of what you were. I kept my hands folded in front of me, fingers rubbing together in a habit I had not been able to break for 5 months. Counting. Not numbers exactly, but measures. How much strength was left in my hands? How long before dizziness returned? How long before hunger turned into that floating sensation where the body feels far away from itself? For 5 months, breadcrumbs had kept me alive. Not bread, not slices. Crumbs. The hard corners scraped from the bottom of tins. The smallest pieces hidden in cuffs, hems, seams. I learned how to break them smaller still, to make them last. I learned to chew slowly, to let the mouth convince the stomach that it was being fed. You never forget the sound crumbs make when they fall into an empty palm. The smell came again, stronger now. Smoke, fat, something sizzling on hot iron. A murmur passed through the line, barely above breath. No one said the word out loud. Saying it felt dangerous. Meat. I lifted my eyes without meaning to. At the far end of the yard, something had changed. Men in denim shirts moved back and forth carrying long wooden tables. They set them down carefully, aligning them end to end. Someone spread white cloth across the surfaces, smoothing it with both hands as if creases mattered. White. I blinked hard, convinced the glare had finally reached my eyes and begun to lie to me. Another table followed. Then another. Chairs came next. Real chairs, not benches. Wooden, with backs. They were arranged evenly, facing one another, as if this were a gathering, not a camp. My chest tightened. This was not how punishments were done. By then we had been in America long enough to understand fragments of the world beyond the fence. We knew June 1944 was not an ordinary month. We knew American soldiers had crossed the Channel and stormed beaches in France. Normandy. We heard the word whispered like a rumor that could not quite be believed. We knew factories here worked day and night, pouring steel and fuel and men into a war that stretched across oceans. Even inside a prison camp, information seeped in. Liberty ships launched faster than they could be counted. Bombers, B-24s, rolling out of factories in numbers that sounded exaggerated, impossible. Tanks, trucks, trains, an entire country reshaping itself into a machine. Machines did not lay white cloth on tables. Machines did not pull out chairs. The smell thickened again. Bread this time. Warm bread. The kind that breaks softly instead of shattering. My mouth filled with saliva before I could stop it, and the shame of that reaction burned hotter than the sun on my neck. I lowered my gaze. Do not look. Looking invites hope, and hope makes hunger unbearable. A memory surfaced anyway, a kitchen far away, before air raid sirens, before ration cards, before counting crumbs, a loaf cooling on a rack, my mother's hands dusted with flour. The memory struck so sharply it hurt, and I pushed it down at once. You could not afford memories like that anymore. A chair scraped against gravel. I flinched. An American voice spoke, calm and unhurried. I did not understand the words at first, only the tone. It was not the tone of command. It was a tone of invitation. No one moved. For a long moment, nothing happened. Cicadas buzzed lazily somewhere beyond the fence. The wire clicked softly as it shifted. Sweat slid down my spine and soaked into the fabric of my uniform. Then one of the women beside me whispered, barely shaping the sound. "For them," she said. "It must be for them." I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that. This could not be meant for us. Prisoners did not sit at tables. Prisoners did not eat from plates. Prisoners learned not to ask questions. The Americans moved again. Plates appeared. Real plates. I saw the pale curve of ceramic catch the light. Forks followed, then knives, metal glinting. Someone set down a pitcher of water. The sound of liquid inside was unmistakable. My knees weakened. 5 months of Crumbs had taught my body what to expect. It did not know what to do with this. One of the cowboys, because there was no other word for men in hats and sun-creased faces, walked toward us and stopped a few steps away. He did not raise his voice. He did not smile broadly or frown. He simply gestured toward the tables. He waited. There was no rush in him, no impatience, no sense that this moment needed to be controlled. And in that pause, before anyone dared to step forward, I understood something that would stay with me long after the war ended. These moments were not about victory or defeat. They were not about flags or speeches or battle maps. They were about choices, made far from the front lines by ordinary people in places like this. These stories aren't about how America won the war, but about how America treated its enemies who fought on the battlefield. If you're truly proud of that, please subscribe to the channel and keep following us. The cowboy nodded once, almost gently. This was supposed to be a prison, yet it looked like Sunday. No one sat down. That was the first thing I noticed when the tables were ready and the chairs stood waiting in neat rows under the Texas sun. The Americans had finished arranging everything. The food was there, the plates were there, the invitation had been made, and still we stood. Our bodies knew how to freeze better than they knew how to move. 5 months of hunger had taught us many things, but trust was not one of them. Hunger sharpens fear until it becomes instinct. It teaches you that nothing is given without cost, that every kindness hides a consequence waiting just out of sight. I felt it tightening in my chest as we remained in line, unsure whether we were being tested. In Germany, we had learned this lesson early. Food did not arrive because you deserved it. It arrived because someone wanted something from you, or because tomorrow it would no longer exist. Bread was counted. Butter was weighed. Sugar disappeared first, then meat, then eggs, then hope. By 1944, even before my capture, food had become something whispered about, something measured in ration cards and excuses. Women stood in lines that curved around buildings, clutching coupons like documents of survival. You learned to recognize the look in another woman's eyes when the bread ran out before her turn came. You learned not to cry. Tears wasted water. We were told that Americans lived differently, but not better. They are soft, the radio voices said. They eat too much and waste it. They do not understand sacrifice. Then the war turned and the stories changed. Americans starve prisoners. They use hunger as punishment. They humiliate you slowly until you forget who you were. Those words followed me across the Atlantic, through the noise of engines and the smell of salt and oil. They settled into my bones during roll calls and inspections. They became explanations for everything I did not understand. So when the tables appeared, my first thought was not relief. It was fear. Fear that this was a trick. Fear that names were being written down somewhere. Fear that eating too much would be remembered later when the plates were gone and punishment returned. No one had to say it out loud. We all felt it. A woman 2 places ahead of me shifted her weight and then stilled, as if afraid movement itself might draw attention. Another clasped her hands together so tightly that her knuckles turned white. I could hear breathing around me, shallow and controlled. I swallowed and tasted nothing. My mouth had learned not to expect food anymore. It reacted only to routine. Wake, line up, count steps, count crumbs. I thought of the last time I had shared bread before coming here. 1 slice, 3 women. We broke it carefully, unevenly, trying to pretend it did not matter who received the smaller piece. We told ourselves it would even out tomorrow. It never did. I had learned to chew slowly then, to let the mouth do all the work, to close my eyes and imagine fullness where none existed. Hunger responds to attention. Ignore it long enough, and it dulls. That skill had kept me alive. It also kept me standing now, unable to move toward the table. The Americans did not rush us. That, too, was unsettling. If this had been a punishment, they would have shouted. If it had been a reward, they would have demanded gratitude. But they did neither. They simply waited, leaning against posts, wiping their hands on cloths, glancing at the sky as if this were an ordinary afternoon. Ordinary afternoons did not include enemy prisoners and white tablecloths. One of the guards looked at us, not sharply, not suspiciously, but with something close to confusion, as if he too could not understand why we did not move. Perhaps he had never been hungry. Perhaps he had grown up in a country where food arrived regularly and did not require courage. That thought stung more than I expected. Because even as prisoners, even behind wire, we knew something about America in 1944. We knew this was a place where farms still produced, where trains carried grain instead of refugees, where factories ran day and night. We had seen it through the cracks of transport trucks and train windows. Endless fields, full silos, cattle by the thousands. And yet here we were, afraid to eat. In Europe, at that same moment, women stood in bombed streets waiting for bread that might never come. They stood with children clinging to their skirts, counting ration cards that no longer matched reality. They listened to aircraft overhead and wondered which building would be gone tomorrow. Hunger there was loud. It announced itself with empty shelves and hollow faces. Hunger here was quiet. It stood in lines and said nothing. I felt a strange shame settle over me as I realized the difference. The world beyond this fence was burning, cities collapsing, families breaking apart, and inside this camp, surrounded by abundance we did not dare touch, we were frozen by fear of being fed. A voice behind me whispered, almost pleading, "Don't go first." I nodded slightly without turning. Going first meant being seen. Being seen meant being remembered. I wondered briefly if this was how they broke people without touching them, if the real cruelty was letting you decide whether to step forward and then punishing you for it later. That was how it had always worked before. The Americans still waited. The sun climbed higher. The smell of bread deepened as it cooled. Flies began to circle lazily near the edge of the tables. Time stretched. Then something small happened. One of the Cowboys reached out and pulled a chair back just a few inches, so it stood ready. He did not look at us when he did it. He did not gesture again. He simply stepped back. The chair remained empty. I realized then that this fear was not something they had created. It was something we had brought with us across the ocean. It was the residue of years spent learning that food was power, and power was never kind. Still, knowing that did not make my legs move. I stood there, suspended between 2 worlds, one where hunger ruled openly, and one where abundance waited silently. And for the first time since my capture, I understood how deeply the war had trained us, not just to fight, but to doubt even mercy itself. If kindness truly existed, it was the most dangerous thing of all, because it asked us to risk believing again. Someone finally moved. It wasn't one of us. An American stepped forward first, as if to show us how ordinary this moment was meant to be. He reached for a pitcher, filled a tin cup with water, and placed it at one end of the table. The metal rang softly as it touched the wood. Then he set down another cup, and another. No announcement followed, no order, no explanation, just the quiet sound of preparation. That was when I understood that the waiting was intentional. They were not testing us. They were giving us time to decide for ourselves whether we would step out of the fear we had carried so far. The cowboys moved with an ease that felt almost careless. One wiped his hands on a cotton kitchen towel, the kind with faint blue stripes woven through it. Another straightened a fork that had been placed crookedly, aligning it with the edge of the plate. Someone else pulled a chair back and then stepped aside, leaving space. They were not performing kindness. They were practicing it. I watched their hands more than their faces. Hands reveal intentions better than words. These hands were steady, familiar with work, used to feeding others. They moved the way hands move at family tables, not tribunals. The chair nearest me stood open. I could feel the eyes of the women beside me, all of us waiting for someone else to be brave first. My legs felt heavy, as if the gravel had grown roots and tangled around my boots. Then a voice spoke behind me, calm and low. "There's enough," the man said. He spoke slowly, as if the words mattered less than the meaning. Then, after a pause, he added, "Eat slow. Not you should, not you must. Just a statement of fact. Enough." The word landed in me harder than any shout could have. I took a step forward before I could stop myself. It felt like stepping off a cliff, in that small movement away from the line. The gravel shifted under my foot, loud in my ears. No one stopped me. No one wrote anything down. I reached the table and stood there, unsure of the next rule. An American pulled out the chair opposite me and waited, hand resting lightly on the backrest. He did not touch me. He did not hurry me. When I hesitated, he nodded once, almost imperceptibly. I sat. The chair held. That detail mattered more than I can explain. The chair did not wobble. It did not creak ominously. It held my weight without complaint, as if it had always expected someone like me to sit there. Others followed then, cautiously at first, then in a slow wave. Chairs scraped. Fabric rustled. Breath was released all at once, like a held note finally allowed to end. The table filled, but the space around it remained calm. Water was poured. Tin cups passed from hand to hand. I lifted mine and felt its cool weight, solid and real. The rim was dented slightly, the mark of use, not neglect. This cup had belonged to someone before me. It would belong to someone after. That thought steadied me. Plates were placed before us, ceramic warmed by the sun. Forks and knives followed, stainless steel catching the light. Real utensils, balanced, clean. A cotton towel brushed my knuckles as an American leaned past to straighten a plate. He smelled faintly of soap and dust. No one watched us closely. No one counted our movements. Some of the guards leaned against posts, talking quietly among themselves. One tipped his hat back to shade his eyes and looked toward the sky, as if checking the time. This was not a spectacle. This was routine. I realized then that this moment had not been invented for us. It was something they already knew how to do. America, in 1944, was feeding millions. Soldiers, workers, families. It fed its own first, and still had enough left to feed us. That fact hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. I had heard whispers about American policy before, fragments passed between prisoners like contraband, that the United States followed rules even in war, that there were conventions, Geneva, someone said, that dictated how enemies were to be treated, that well-fed prisoners caused fewer problems, that fewer guards were needed when fear was not the primary tool. At the time, those ideas had sounded like propaganda of a different kind. Sitting at that table, they felt like engineering. Not the cold engineering of machines and steel, but of human behavior. Feed people. Treat them predictably. Do not humiliate them. Violence decreases. Resistance fades. It was efficient. It was also moral. Those two things did not often exist together where I came from. The food arrived without ceremony. Bread first, thick slices placed in the center of the table. I watched steam lift from the crust and disappear. Butter followed, pale and soft, already melting in the heat. Then meat, laid out carefully, portions generous but not obscene. Potatoes, vegetables. I did not reach for anything at first. My hands rested in my lap, clenched tightly as if they did not trust themselves. Across from me, an American caught my eye briefly. He did not smile. He did not look away either. He simply waited. I took a piece of bread and broke it in half. The sound it made, a soft tear instead of a crack, sent a sharp ache through my chest. I ate slowly, just as he had said. No one rushed us, no one commented. The Cowboys ate with us, the same food, at the same pace. They drank from the same cups. One wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and then laughed quietly at something another said. The sound was easy, unguarded. This was what unsettled me most. They did not behave like conquerors. They behaved like hosts. I thought of the world beyond this place, of beaches in France where young men lay in the sand, of factories where women worked double shifts, of ships crossing oceans heavy with steel and fuel. America was at the height of its power in that moment. It could afford cruelty. It could afford indifference. Instead, it chose this. Not speeches, not banners, not lessons, a table, chairs, water, food. I understood then why they did not explain anything to us. Explanations invite argument. This invited participation. By the time my plate was half empty, my hands had stopped shaking. By the time it was finished, I realized I was full in a way that went beyond the body. For the first time since my capture, I did not feel managed. I felt included. And in that quiet, ordinary act of being fed without condition, I began to see the outline of something larger taking shape. Not just a policy, not just a country at war, but an identity. One that believed strength did not need to announce itself. One that trusted abundance more than fear. One that could defeat an enemy without first stripping them of their humanity. The war was still raging beyond the fence. Men were still dying. Bombs were still falling. But here, at this table in Texas, America revealed something else it was fighting for, and it did so without saying a word. The first thing that betrayed me was not my hunger. It was my hands. I'd been sitting at the table for several minutes before I realized they were trembling. Not violently, not enough for anyone else to notice, just a small, persistent shake, as if my body had finally reached the point where it could no longer pretend this moment was not real. Across from me, the plate waited. The knife lay where it had been placed, its handle warm from the sun. I wrapped my fingers around it carefully, as if sudden movement might shatter the fragile order of the afternoon. The metal felt heavier than it should have, or perhaps my hands had simply grown weaker than I remembered. I lifted the knife. It dipped, just slightly, enough that I had to steady it with my other hand. I told myself it was nothing. Fatigue. Heat. 5 months of living on less than the body requires. But the truth was simpler and far more dangerous. My body no longer trusted abundance. The knife hovered over the meat, and in that suspended moment, time stretched again. The table faded at the edges. The sound of cicadas receded. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and uneven. Then, somewhere to my left, a chair scraped sharply across the gravel. The sound cut through the stillness like a crack in glass. A woman collapsed. She did not cry out. She did not even gasp. One moment she was sitting upright, her hands folded neatly in front of her plate, and the next her body folded inward, slipping sideways as if the strength had simply drained out of her all at once. Her chair tipped. Wood struck stone. A fork clattered to the ground and spun once before coming to rest. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Not the guards, not the cowboys, not us. Then 2 Americans were there, steady and quick, lowering her gently to the ground. One slid a folded jacket beneath her head. Another spoke softly, words I could not understand but did not need to. His voice was calm, reassuring, unafraid. No one shouted, no one barked orders. The rest of us sat frozen, eyes fixed on the small circle forming around her. I realized then that this was the sound we had all been holding back. Not screams, just the quiet collapse of a body that had carried too much for too long. Someone pushed a tin cup toward her lips when she stirred. Someone else shielded her from the sun. There was no spectacle in it, no drama, just care. And still, something inside me broke. My grip on the knife loosened. It slipped from my fingers and struck the plate with a dull sound, then slid to the table. I stared at it as if it belonged to someone else. The tears came without warning. Not sobs, not gasping cries, just a sudden pressure behind my eyes, then warmth spilling over. I lowered my head quickly, ashamed of the weakness. But the tears fell anyway, landing on my hands, on the tablecloth, darkening the white fabric in small, irregular circles. I pressed my lips together hard enough to hurt. Across the table, I heard a sharp intake of breath. Someone else, trying not to cry. Someone further down let out a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob and immediately covered her mouth. The breakdown moved quietly, from woman to woman, like a tide you could not see but could feel pulling at your ankles. The Americans did not look away. They did not stare either. They stayed where they were. That mattered. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and forced myself to look down again at the plate. The food was still there. It had not vanished while I cried. No one had taken it away. No punishment followed. I picked up the knife again, this time with both hands. The shaking did not stop. I cut a small piece, smaller than necessary, smaller than polite. My instincts still whispered that taking less was safer. I lifted it to my mouth, and suddenly I was not in Texas anymore. I was in a kitchen that no longer existed. The floor beneath my feet was worn smooth by years of footsteps. Sunlight slanted through a window dressed with thin curtains. The table was crowded. Too many elbows, too many plates, voices overlapping. Someone laughed. Someone argued about nothing at all. My father sat at the head of the table, his sleeves rolled up, his hands already scarred from work. My mother moved between stove and sink with practiced ease, wiping her hands on a towel she always kept tucked into her apron. The smell in the air was the same as this one: meat, bread, heat, comfort. I could see it so clearly it made my chest ache. Sunday dinner. The one meal that had always mattered, even when there was little else. The meal where everyone sat down together, no excuses, no interruptions. The meal where time slowed, just enough to remind you that you belonged somewhere. My grandmother used to say that as long as there was a table, there was a family. The memory struck me with such force that I forgot where I was. I put the food into my mouth. It was not hunger that overwhelmed me then. It was recognition. The taste unlocked something I had sealed away when the war began. Not pleasure, not indulgence, safety. My throat tightened. I chewed slowly, deliberately, afraid that if I rushed, the moment would break apart. The food was warm, properly cooked, seasoned by someone who knew what they were doing. I swallowed. The table came back into focus. The Texas sun, the white cloth, the tin cups, the women around me, each caught in her own quiet reckoning. I saw one press her fingers to her lips, eyes closed as if praying. Another stared at her plate, tears sliding down her cheeks unchecked. Someone laughed softly through tears, shaking her head as if she could not quite accept what was happening. The cowboys had stepped back, giving us space. One leaned against a post, arms crossed loosely, watching the sky. Another sat down at the far end of the table and took a bite of his own food, unhurried. That small act grounded me. They were not feeding us at us. They were eating with us. I took another bite, and another. Each one came easier than the last. The breakdown did not end all at once. It moved in waves. A dropped fork here, a hand gripping the edge of the table there. A quiet sob quickly swallowed, but there was no chaos, just release. I thought then of the kitchens I had seen from train windows in this country, of houses with wide porches, of tables that looked like they had been built to hold many people. I thought of American families, gathering on Sundays just as mine once had, unaware that far away, enemy women would one day sit at a table and be undone by the same simple ritual. I wondered if the women who cooked these meals back home, mothers, grandmothers, knew that what they taught their sons was not just how to fight, but how to feed. I finished my plate. The emptiness I expected did not return. Instead, something settled in its place. A quiet weight. Not heaviness, but presence. As if a part of myself I had been carrying at arm's length had finally come home. I wiped my hands on the cotton cloth provided, folded it neatly, and placed it beside the plate. The small act felt ceremonial, though no one had told me to do it. Around the table, others did the same. No one spoke. We did not need to. Because in that moment, surrounded by strangers who had chosen not to treat us like enemies, we were connected, not by language or loyalty, but by memory, by kitchens left behind, by Sunday dinners remembered, by the understanding that food, offered without threat, could reach places even war had failed to destroy. And for the first time since I had been taken prisoner, I cried not because I was afraid, but because I remembered who I had been before the world broke apart. The realization did not arrive all at once. It came quietly, after the plates had been cleared and the chairs pushed back into place, after the worst of the trembling had passed, after the crying had softened into something like exhaustion. I noticed it when I looked up and saw the men still standing there. They had not left. The cowboys remained at the edge of the yard, leaning against posts, hands resting loosely at their sides. They were not watching us for compliance. They were not counting how much we had eaten. They were simply there, as if this moment required their presence until it was finished. One of them wiped his hands on a cotton towel and folded it carefully before setting it aside. Another adjusted his hat against the sun and squinted toward the horizon. A third stood with his arms crossed, weight shifted to one leg, looking at nothing in particular. They looked tired. That, more than anything else, unsettled me. War had taught me to recognize exhaustion. I had seen it in soldiers marching past villages reduced to rubble. I had seen it in women bent over factory machines long after their bodies had given up. I had seen it in myself, reflected in polished metal and dark windows. These men carried the same weariness. And suddenly, I wondered what they carried with it. Somewhere across the ocean, young Americans were dying. We knew that much. Normandy was no rumor anymore. Names came through the camp like echoes, beaches, hedgerows, towns whose spelling we could not pronounce. We knew that families here waited for letters that did not always arrive, that mothers stared at doors in the evenings, listening for footsteps that would never come. It struck me then, with an almost physical force, that some of the men standing before us might already have lost someone, a son, a brother, a cousin, someone who had fallen fighting people who wore the same uniform I did. And still, they stood there. They had not withheld food from us in the name of justice. They had not made us earn it through humiliation. They had not reminded us of our defeat. They had simply fed us. The thought left me dizzy. In the world I came from, power announced itself loudly. It demanded acknowledgement. It punished first and explained later. Cruelty was not a failure of strength. It was proof of it. Here, power looked different. Here, power looked like restraint. I watched as one of the cowboys noticed a woman lingering at the table, staring at her empty plate as if unsure whether she was allowed to leave. He did not say anything. He simply nodded once and stepped aside, clearing her path. She stood, hesitated, then walked away. No one stopped her. No one corrected her. That was when the sentence formed in my mind, fully and unmistakably. Power doesn't need cruelty. It startled me how obvious it suddenly felt. This country did not need to starve us to prove anything. It did not need to break us to win. It had already won, on battlefields, in factories, in numbers so large they defied belief. What remained was a choice, and they chose not to use suffering as punctuation. As the yard slowly returned to its ordinary shape, the tables were cleared away with the same unremarkable care they had been brought in. The white cloths were folded, the chairs stacked neatly. Nothing was rushed, nothing was hidden. Life continued. That night, back in the barracks, I lay awake long after the lights were dimmed. The others slept fitfully around me, breath uneven, bodies still adjusting to fullness. The smell of food lingered faintly in the air, mixed with soap and dust. I reached beneath my mattress and pulled out the small notebook I had kept hidden since my capture. It was not much. A few pages, a pencil worn down to a stub, words written sparingly, as if too many might draw attention. I hesitated before opening it. Writing had always felt dangerous. Putting things into words made them real. It meant admitting what had happened, what had changed. Finally, I turned to a blank page and began. I ate like a human being today. Nothing bad happened. I stared at the lines for a long time after writing them. They looked simple, almost childish, but they contained more truth than anything I had written since the war began. Nothing bad happened. No punishment followed. No rations were cut. No names were called. The sky did not fall. Instead, something else had happened. A wall I did not know was there had cracked. I thought of the stories we had been told about America before the war. Stories of chaos, of moral decay, of a nation too soft to endure sacrifice. We had been taught that discipline came from fear, that order came from force. Yet the order I had seen that day came from confidence, from knowing there was enough, from trusting that treating people decently did not weaken you. It stabilized you. This, I realized, was not kindness as performance. It was kindness as infrastructure. The United States had built systems that allowed this moment to exist. Farms that produced more than was needed. Trains that delivered without interruption. Policies that valued predictability over revenge. Rules written not in anger, but in anticipation of what humans become when they are not starved. This was the work of a generation. The men we called the greatest generation did not speak that name aloud. They did not claim it for themselves. They lived it quietly, in places like this, far from parades and headlines. They did not boast about morality. They operationalized it. I understood then that the defeat we were experiencing was not merely military. It was philosophical. We had believed that strength required hardness, that compassion was a liability, that enemies deserved suffering. America had answered that belief without argument. It had answered it with a table, with food, with the decision to treat us not as symbols, but as people whose war had ended the moment we were captured. I closed the notebook and slid it back beneath the mattress. Around me, the barracks breathed. Someone turned in her sleep. Someone murmured a name. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, aware of a strange new sensation settling over me. Not hope, understanding. They had defeated us without humiliating us. And in doing so, they had taken something from us that no weapon ever could, the certainty that cruelty was the measure of power. That certainty was gone. In its place was a question I could not yet answer. If this was what strength looked like, what had we been fighting for all along? The question stayed with me long after the lights went out. It followed me through the next morning's roll call, through the measured rhythm of camp life returning to its familiar shape. It lingered as we worked, as we ate, as we stood again behind the fence watching trains pass in the distance. What kind of country was this? I asked myself that as I watched an American truck roll past the camp gates, its bed stacked high with crates stamped with words I could not fully read, but understood well enough. Food, supplies, equipment. Everything moved with purpose. Nothing seemed wasted. Nothing seemed panicked. America 1944 felt like a place in motion, but not in collapse. From where I stood, behind wire and under guard, I could still sense it. A country pulling in the same direction. Farms feeding factories. Factories feeding armies. Armies feeding back into something larger than themselves. Even captivity did not shield us from that impression. We heard it in fragments. In the casual remarks of guards who spoke about shifts at nearby plants. In the hum of trains that never seemed to stop running. In the way supplies arrived on schedule, without drama, without excuses. Production was not just happening here. It was happening everywhere. Liberty ships sliding into the water faster than they could be named. Bombers assembled by men and women who had never seen the front lines but understood exactly why their work mattered. An economy turned outward, focused, relentless. But what struck me most was not the scale. It was the confidence. This country did not act like one on the brink of desperation. It acted like one that believed tomorrow was something it could still shape. Back home, in 1944, the feeling was different. Europe felt brittle then, like glass already cracked and waiting for the final blow. Cities bombed into silhouettes, rail lines broken, fields abandoned or burned. Women standing in ration lines with faces hardened by disappointment, learning to read the future in the expressions of clerks behind counters. In Germany, unity had been demanded. Here, unity seemed assumed. We had been told that America was chaotic, divided, undisciplined, that it could not sustain a long war, that it lacked the will to endure sacrifice. Standing in that camp, watching how effortlessly order asserted itself, I wondered how many lies were required to keep us from seeing the truth. This country was not perfect. We knew that, too. We heard whispers of strikes, of arguments, of disagreements that flared even in wartime. But those arguments did not stop production. They did not halt trains or empty tables. Disagreement existed, but so did direction. There was a common understanding of what was at stake. The enemy was clear, and perhaps that clarity mattered more than any slogan. I thought about the men who guarded us. They came from different places, farms, cities, towns whose names meant nothing to me. Their accents shifted, their habits differed. Some were quiet, some talked too much, but they wore the same uniform, and, more importantly, they acted from the same assumptions, that prisoners would be fed, that rules would be followed, that cruelty was unnecessary. No one debated those things aloud. They were simply done. I wondered then what would happen to a country like this once the war ended. What happens when the enemy disappears? What happens when the story told loudly, but as one carried carefully, like something fragile that might break if handled too roughly? When the war ended, we were sent home to a country that barely resembled the one we had left. Cities lay in ruins. Families were scattered. Hunger followed us across borders, settling into kitchens that no longer smelled like bread or meat, but like absence. And yet, among the things we brought back with us, among the grief, the guilt, the questions we could not answer, there was also that memory. The table, the white cloth, the way no one shouted, the way nothing bad happened. For a long time, many of us did not speak about it. Gratitude toward an enemy felt complicated in the years immediately after the war. Survival alone demanded all our attention. Rebuilding did not leave room for reflection, but time has a way of loosening silence. As years passed, the stories began to surface quietly. In letters, in journals, in conversations between old friends who trusted one another enough to admit confusion alongside pain. We told our children, first cautiously, then more openly. We told them that captivity had not always looked the way they imagined, that there had been moments, small, human moments, that did not fit neatly into stories of good and evil. We told them about America, about Texas heat and gravel underfoot, about cowboys who did not insult us, about plates and forks and cups made of tin, about being fed without condition. Some listened with disbelief, others with curiosity, and some, years later, crossed oceans themselves to see the places where those stories had happened. I have met their children since then, the children of prisoners, the grandchildren of women who once counted crumbs. They speak with accents shaped by peace, not war. They ask careful questions. They say thank you, not as a formality, but as something deeply considered. They say thank you to a country they know mostly through inherited memory. They say thank you for a kindness that reached across uniform and language and hatred and chose restraint instead. I have also met Americans who carry their own inheritance. Men and women whose fathers guarded camps like the one that held us, whose grandmothers cooked meals and taught their sons that food was not just fuel, but care, who grew up hearing that their parents did not talk much about the war, except to say that they did what needed to be done. They listen when I speak. Sometimes they cry. Sometimes they are quiet for a long time. And sometimes they say, softly, "That sounds like my grandfather." That is when I understand how deeply connected these stories are, not to victory, but to identity. I'm often asked what defeated us in the end. People expect me to say bombs, or tanks, or numbers too large to comprehend. But that is not the full truth. We were defeated long before the war officially ended. We were defeated the day we realized that power could exist without cruelty. We were defeated the day we sat at a table in Texas and discovered that our enemy did not need to humiliate us to prove anything. We were defeated the day we were treated as human beings when it was not required. I wrote it once, simply, in a notebook I no longer have. They fed us when they didn't have to. That is what defeated us forever. Because that kind of defeat leaves no room. Shared purpose fades. It was not a question I could answer. Not then. Years later, long after I would leave this place, I would hear stories about America changing, about factories closing, about arguments growing louder than agreements, about neighbors no longer trusting one another's motives. But in 1944, none of that was visible from where I stood. From my vantage point, America felt singular. Not because everyone agreed, but because everyone moved forward anyway. I thought of the table again, of how easily it had been set, of how little discussion it had required. No vote, no debate, just an assumption. This is what we do. That assumption fascinated me. Would this still be possible in another time? Would a country still feed its enemies so generously if it no longer believed in itself? Would people still trust abundance over fear if they doubted tomorrow? The question was dangerous, even to think, because it suggested that what I had witnessed was not inevitable, that it depended on conditions that could change. Strength, confidence, unity, moral certainty. Those things, I realized, were as fragile as they were powerful. I watched an American guard share a cigarette with another near the fence, their conversation casual, unguarded. They laughed about something small, something unimportant. Life continued. That, too, was a kind of victory. Not the loud kind celebrated in headlines. The quiet kind that allows ordinary days to exist even in the shadow of war. I wondered what Americans watching this story years from now would feel. Would they recognize this version of themselves? Would they feel pride, nostalgia, distance? Would they ask the same question I was asking now? Would we still do this today? Would we still believe that feeding an enemy could make us stronger, not weaker? No one answered that question for me. The Americans did not explain themselves then, and I will not pretend to explain them now. I only know what I saw. A country at the height of its power choosing restraint. A nation capable of cruelty deciding it was unnecessary. A generation that did not talk about values, but built systems that enforced them quietly, day after day. Perhaps that is what made it feel different. Not better in every way, not immune to failure, but grounded in something solid enough to hold even its enemies without fear. Standing there between past and future, I understood that the comparison was unavoidable. Between then and now, between certainty and doubt, between unity forged by necessity and division born of comfort. I did not judge, I only wondered. What kind of country had this been? And what kind of country would it choose to be again if it ever needed to? The fence rattled softly in the wind. The trains kept moving, and the question remained unanswered, waiting for Americans this time to decide. Years later, long after the fences were taken down and the barracks dismantled, the memory of that table remained. Not as a storm for resentment. Only recognition. Recognition that strength is not measured solely by what a nation can destroy, but by what it refuses to. Recognition that rules matter only when followed in moments where breaking them would be easier. Recognition that the true test of power is not how it treats the weak, but how it treats the defeated. That is the legacy of that table. Not a story of American victory, but of American restraint. Not a lesson shouted across generations, but one demonstrated quietly, then trusted to endure. To those who watch this story now, from a distance measured in decades, I offer no instruction, only a reminder. There was a time when this country believed so deeply in itself that it did not fear feeding its enemies. There was a time when abundance made generosity possible, and confidence made cruelty unnecessary. That time is worth remembering, not because it was perfect, but because it proves something essential, that when a nation holds power and chooses humanity instead of humiliation, it creates a legacy no war can erase. This is why we remember, not to relive the past, but to recognize what is possible, again,